In most ancient, medieval, and early modern societies, torture was legally and morally acceptable. Join us as we look at the worst punishments throughout human history. Riding the Stang. For centuries, rural Britain was home to a peculiar kind of community punishment known as riding the Stang in the north of England and Scotland, while in sections of southern England it was known as Skimmington Riding. Despite the various names, both customs required a large group of villagers participating in a boisterous parade to shame the perpetrator. When a husband was known to have physically assaulted his wife, the village's young men would take the initiative and organize the parade. The Stang, which was essentially a hurdle or pole, was the parade's main element. As part of the show, a comical or mimic figure from the community would be mounted on the Stang and paraded through the streets. The parade was distinguished by great noise. Pots and pans were banged together, and locals used whistles and horns to create a rowdy mood. This entertaining display was aimed to raise awareness and reinforce community norms. Typically, the procession would wind its way through the hamlet, eventually arriving at the transgressor's home, where he or she would most likely be gazing anxiously out from behind the curtains, conscious of the public humiliation. In some circumstances, the person being carried on the Stang served as an ally in the humiliating, while in others, the ridicule was directed at the actual culprit. The practice of riding the Stang served as a social mechanism for publicly humiliating people who violated community morals, notably in cases of domestic abuse. Some of the last known incidents of this practice occurred as recently as 1889, demonstrating its continued existence into the late 19th century. The Heretics Fork. The Heretics Fork was a two-pronged metal tool, often with one prong placed between the sternum and breastbone and the other aiming towards the throat. It was formed like a fork or a long pin and could be attached to the victim's body. The gadget was intended to produce significant agony and pain without resulting in immediate death. The fork would hinder the victim from moving comfortably because any movement would push the prongs deeper into the body, exacerbating the discomfort and making it difficult to rest or sleep. The Heretics Fork was primarily employed to obtain confessions from those suspected of heresy or treason. As part of the Inquisition's torture procedures, it acted as both a physical form of punishment and a psychological approach to inspire dread. Gibbeting. Gibbeting involved executing a condemned criminal and then displaying their body in a gibbet as a warning to others. This procedure was supposed to be both a punishment for the deceased and a deterrent to others. It usually followed a hanging or execution. Following the execution, the individual's body was placed on an iron cage or gibbet and shown in public. The gibbet was frequently erected on a pole or building in a visible position, such as a crossroads or near towns, so that the people might see the body. This provided a sobering reminder of the dangers of unlawful behavior. Gibbeting was most common in Europe, especially throughout the medieval and early modern eras. It was widely employed for terrible crimes like murder, robbery, and treason. The practice was frequently established in law, and judges might use gibbeting as part of a sentence for specific offenses. It was viewed not only as punishment, but also as a form of social control. Poena cullae. Poena cullae is a phrase from Roman law that refers to a special type of penalty previously reserved for the crime of parricide, or killing one's own parents. The punishment was severe. The accused individual would be sewed into a leather sack with numerous creatures, such as a dog, rooster, monkey, and viper, and then thrown into water, effectively drowning or being executed with little hope of escape. This punishment was designed to match the gravity of the crime, as parricide was seen as one of the most heinous offenses, breaching society's core familial relationships. Poena cullae has been used in many judicial and literary contexts throughout history to represent extreme justice and community abhorrence of the crime of murdering one's own family members. Oubliettes. The French word oubliette comes from the verb oublier, which means to forget. One reason it gained its moniker was that a prisoner was dumped into a hole, such as a well, and then forgotten. An oubliette was a particular kind of prison with a trap door at the top that the prisoner could not reach. Sometimes the shape of this appalling jail was like a little passageway, too small for the prisoner to sit down or even bend over. He was flogged to death, either standing or lying prone. All he could see of the grate was that it was high above and out of reach. He could tilt his head back to see what he was missing. Sometimes oubliettes were constructed inside the walls of a castle's upper stories rather than in the dungeon, allowing victims to hear and smell the life of the castle as they slowly perished from hunger in appalling circumstances. The bodies were abandoned to be eaten by animals, and decades later, several oubliettes were found to be littered with human bones. Keel hauling. Keel hauling was a kind of punishment and possible execution administered to sailors at sea. The sailor was pulled under the ship's keel, either the whole length of the ship or just from one side to the other, after being fastened to a line looped beneath the hull. The widespread assumption is that keel hauling carried a death sentence by cruel pain or, at the absolute least, a crippling. Because barnacles and other marine flora frequently coated the ship's hull, keel hauling would normally cause severe cuts from which the sufferer would later develop an infection and scars. Though this would usually lead to the victim drowning, dragging the sufferer gently might lower him enough to avoid the barnacles. Colliding against the hull or keel also carried a risk of head damage, particularly if the ship was moving. The garrote. It is known that the garrote was in use in Rome in the 1st century BC. The instrument is depicted in some early reliefs and is mentioned in stories of the Second Catalonian Conspiracy, in which conspirators, among them Publius Cornelius Lentulus Sura, were strangled with a lacus in the Tullianum. It was also in use in Portugal and Spain during the Middle Ages. When the Americas were being conquered, it was used most famously to execute the Inca ruler Atahualpa. It was meant to be a more humane method of punishment than burning heretics, who were to be quickly strangled by the Spanish Inquisition after being found guilty. Later garrotes had an iron collar with a big metal screw at the back. The belief held that the sufferer would die instantly when the screw tightened and crushed their brainstem. The screw would just burrow into their neck while the iron collar choked him, though if it missed the spot where the brain meets the spinal column, the pain could last for a while. Strangulation was a privilege of prominent officials and the ruling family in the Ottoman Empire. The Spanish version had a tightening collar, this one had a bowstring. Throughout the Peninsular War, French soldiers often executed Spanish guerrillas, priests and other Napoleonic opponents with the garrote. The first documented metallic garrote debuted in Spain about 1810, and on April 28, 1828, the garrote was proclaimed the only way that citizens were to be executed there. The last public garroting in Spain took place in Barcelona in May 1897. Everything was executed within jails after that. The rack. The victim's limbs were often fastened onto the rack, which was a rectangular frame with rollers at both ends. The victim's limbs were fastened to the rollers by means of straps, while the victim's body was slowly stretched as the rollers at either end were turned. Muscles and joints were put through tremendous stress during this process, which could cause dislocation and excruciating pain. The Inquisition and other court authorities frequently utilized the rack during trials for heresy, witchcraft, and treason. Its purpose was to punish individuals suspected of major crimes or to coerce them into making confessions. The rack was a common tool for torture in many trials, particularly those involving witch hunts. The Iron Maiden. The Iron Maiden was a notorious torture device thought to have originated in Europe during the Middle Ages. A huge iron or steel coffin-like box was the usual appearance of the Iron Maiden. When the device was closed, the inside was lined with sharp items or spikes that could impale the victim. Placing the victim inside the Iron Maiden and then closing the door would cause the spikes to pierce the body, resulting in a torturous and terrible death. There was no way out of this contraption once the victim was inside. Impalement. A cruel and painful death was often the outcome of impalement, which involved driving a sharp spike or rod into the victim's flesh. This method, which is regarded as among the most agonizing forms of punishment, has been documented in various cultures across time. One way was to use a pointed stake to pierce the victim's body, usually through the vagina or rectum, and then exit through the mouth or shoulders. Various cultural practices of execution dictated the specific manner of carrying out the act. As a graphic message against rebellion, disobedience, or disrespect for authority, public displays of impaled victims were commonplace. The Wallachian king Vlad III, also called Vlad the Impaler or Vlad Dracula, lived in the 15th century and was said to have used impalement as a means of punishing his enemies and instilling fear in the populace. As a result, this form of execution has a long history in Dracula mythology. Scaphism. Scaphism was a brutal method of torture and execution. The procedure involved trapping a victim between two boats or hollowed-out tree trunks and causing them to die slowly and painfully. The victim's limbs would be restrained as they were placed between two boats or two hollowed trunks. The vessels would be lowered into the water, allowing victims to remain half immersed. The executioners would feed the victim a concoction of milk and honey to induce diarrhea. The milk and honey would attract insects, creating a scenario in which the victim would be devoured alive by the insects, exposed to the elements, and deprived of essential necessities. Crucifixion. Executions via crucifixion were among the most horrific and notorious in human history. A public and agonizing execution was carried out by pinning or nailing a victim to a large wooden cross or stake. The Romans were among numerous civilizations who adopted this method. Even ancient civilizations, like the Assyrians and the Greeks, executed criminals via crucifixion. The Roman Empire is most thought of when one thinks about torture because of its widespread use as a punishment for slaves, insurgents, and criminals throughout that time. In most cases, the victim would have been severely beaten or scourged before being crucified, which would have rendered them physically weak and in excruciating pain. Prisoners were nailed or tied to the cross for the actual crucifixion to take place. Death by asphyxiation, shock, or prolonged exposure was a common cause of their abandonment. To deter others from carrying out similar crimes, the crucifixion was conceived as a public spectacle. Victims were often left exposed in public places like roadsides to get more attention. The Catherine wheel. The Catherine wheel was made of a big wooden wheel with spokes. The condemned person was bound to the wheel, and the executioner used a heavy item to break the prisoner's limbs, typically resulting in a long, excruciating death. After the limbs were broken, the wheel could be placed in public, leaving the victim to die slowly, frequently as a warning to others. This kind of punishment was once used for a variety of major offenses, including robbery, murder, and treason. It was exceptionally harsh, designed to be both a method of execution and a kind of public humiliation. The Catherine wheel was sometimes used in conjunction with other forms of torture, exacerbating the punishment's terrible effects on both the individual's body and psyche. While both men and women might be executed by the Catherine wheel, women were particularly targeted during times of social upheaval, such as witch hunts. Women accused of witchcraft or moral transgressions faced increased scrutiny and abuse. The use of such cruel punishments against women typically paralleled the gender dynamics of the time, in which women were widely marginalized and regularly persecuted. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, cultural attitudes on punishment began to shift. Growing initiatives to abolish torture and capital punishment resulted in the demise of tortures such as the Catherine wheel. Many cultures adopted more compassionate modes of punishment, and the Catherine wheel was finally regarded as a sign of savagery and brutality. Rodent love. The rat torturer entailed subjecting a prisoner to excruciating agony by using rats. The application of a rat or several rats to the victim's body, frequently in an enclosed area, was a typical method of rat torture. The rats would be let go, usually with the aim of inflicting terror and misery. The strategy relied on the victim's natural aversion to rats so that they would try to flee. The rats would be starved until they gnawed at the flesh of the victim, causing them immense agony, according to some tales. Flaying. If you don't know what the word flaying means, you will soon find out, and trust me, you will thank the gods that you are not an accused criminal living a long time ago. It was not uncommon for convicts to be executed after undergoing various forms of torture. Some capital crimes involved the subject being blinded, then stripped, and ultimately flayed alive. The living victim was occasionally executed by removing the skin in strips, which extended the execution and clearly caused great suffering with each strip removed. In other situations, the entire skin was removed in one piece. Death in both cases was frequently caused by heart failure. In some executions, only a few pieces of skin were removed, leaving the victim to perish from hypothermia or wound infections. Flaying was not new. It had been done by both the Babylonians and the Assyrians before their conquest. During the First Persian Empire of the Achaemenid dynasty, magistrates in all four kingdom states documented it. In one example, a judge was executed for accepting bribes by flaying, and the skin was used to upholster a chair for the judge who succeeded him on the bench, who happened to be the executed judge's son. Thus, the succeeding judge was reminded of his father's fate daily, as well as what would happen if he succumbed to the temptation of profitable but illicit operations within his office. I'm sure that was enough of an incentive for the son to never cross the line. Would it be enough for you? The Roman candle. The Roman candle was more of a show execution. Prisoners were tied to a stake and drenched in slow-burning flammable material, usually tree or plant resin, and then set on fire. It was apparently a favorite of Roman Emperor Nero, who was insane. He persecuted devout Christians by coating their hanged bodies with pitch, oil, wax, and other combustible substances before lighting their feet and using them as human candles. The Roman candles were used to illuminate ceremonial gatherings in the imperial gardens, while also prolonging torment and misery. Elite attendees at these private meetings sought enjoyment from the suffering, while candles provided decoration and torchlight, which they deemed attractive. Today, the phrase Roman candle refers to a firework that is only associated with ancient Rome by name. The classic firecracker originated in China and today evokes cheerful childhood memories of a much-loved item. Worlds away from torches of the past. Judas Cradle. It is well known that the Judas Cradle used brutal techniques to humiliate and torture its victims. The victims were placed into a seat or apparatus that had a pyramid shape. The victim would be positioned beneath the pyramid's tip before it would be undressed and lowered onto the pointed end of the pyramid, which would stab the body. It was the goal of the invention to cause excruciating pain, but not instantaneous death. During the Inquisition, the Judas Cradle was frequently utilized to extract confessions from individuals who were believed to be heretics or witches. Torture like this was a tool in a much broader system of religious and political control. The punishment for many criminals, especially those found guilty of heinous crimes or rebellions against authority, extended beyond its religious uses. Iron chair. The iron chair was no ordinary chair, and sitting in one was not comfortable to say the least. The iron chair was primarily made of iron and had metal spikes or other sharp components intended to cause suffering to the victim. The chair was typically heated to heighten the agony factor. Victims were strapped into the chair, and the spikes dug into their flesh, causing severe injuries and pain. The heat compounded the pain, making it a particularly horrible kind of torture. The iron chair was largely used as a form of torture to compel confessions or punish those accused of crimes such as heresy, witchcraft, or treason. During Europe's late medieval and early modern witch hunts, women, particularly those suspected of witchcraft or moral failings, were frequently subjected to such cruel kinds of punishment. Torture tactics, such as the iron chair, were frequently used in public settings, serving as both a punishment for the person and a warning to the community. This performance was designed to create terror and conformity among the public. Such harsh punishments fostered to a culture of dread, particularly among women who were frequently accused of witchcraft, caused increased social tension. The Spanish donkey. The extreme brutality of the Spanish donkey made it a common tool for the punishment and compulsion of those accused of heresy or other major crimes. The Spanish donkey is a device with a triangle or wedge shape. The victim would lie on top of the apparatus, with their feet hanging over the edges and their legs spread wide. Severe pressure and agony would be inflicted on the victim's legs by means of weights. Hip dislocation and terrible pain were intended outcomes of this operation's deliberate aim to induce significant bodily suffering. The objective of intentionally extending the duration of torture was to heighten the suffering experience, coerce confessions, or inflict punishment on the convicted. In its notorious use of torture to quell heresy and rebellion, the Spanish Inquisition was closely associated with the Spanish donkey. The Pair of Anguish. The Pair of Anguish looks like a pear-shaped metal device with a central core that may be extended by manipulating a screw mechanism. The device was often hollow and tapering, with spikes or serrations embedded inside. The gadget would be put into the victim's orifice, usually the mouth, vagina, or anus, and would expand as the screw was cranked, causing terrible pain and internal tissue injury. The Pair of Anguish was used to torture people for a variety of reasons, including charges of heresy, blasphemy, and sexual crimes. This practice was especially severe and was occasionally employed to get confessions from convicted individuals. During the witch hunts, many women, particularly those accused of witchcraft or moral breaches, were exposed to this horrific type of torture. The Pair of Anguish, as a kind of torture, might be used against them to punish and intimidate, and has become a symbol of ancient law systems' severe actions, demonstrating how cultures dealt with crime and opposition. What perplexes me the most about all these torture techniques is that humans came up with them, making us more barbaric than animals. What is your opinion on this matter? Why don't you tell us in the comments below? Well, that's it for now. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please give us a like and let us know in the comments what you think. Check out our other videos and subscribe to be part of the fun. Click on the notification icon so you can see our new videos as soon as they're uploaded. Thank you for watching and see you next time.